Melania Trump drops a truth bomb that not only catches the host off guard but completely turns the tables on the media. The liberal host thought they could control the conversation, until Melania traps them with a response so powerful, it left them speechless. What she said next has the internet in a frenzy. You've never seen Melania like this before. Find out why this interview is causing shockwaves across the media. Trust us, you won't want to miss this. For years, Melania Trump had been the subject of scrutiny, but she had largely stayed out of the limelight. She was never as vocal as her husband, Donald Trump, and had chosen a quieter path during their time in the White House. While other members of the Trump family often found themselves embroiled in controversial debates, Melania was often seen as more reserved. She had maintained a relatively low profile throughout her husband's presidency, often focusing on initiatives related to children, like the Be Best campaign, and staying away from the heated political drama that surrounded her family. But that night, everything changed. The liberal host, who had become known for their fiery rhetoric against conservative figures, was determined to get a reaction from Melania. They had prepared sharp questions, expecting her to shy away from tough topics, just like she had done in the past. But what they didn't anticipate was that Melania was ready to speak her mind, and she wasn't going to let the host push her around. The host had asked a standard question about her time in the White House, expecting a standard answer. But Melania's response was anything but typical. In a calm and composed manner, she began to speak about the media's treatment of her family, the constant misrepresentation, and the double standards she had witnessed in politics. As she spoke, the host began to realize they were no longer in control of the conversation. The questions they had been prepared to ask seemed insignificant in comparison to the points Melania was raising. What had Melania said to shift the entire tone of the conversation so dramatically? As the words left her mouth, the host's face froze. It was as if they were hearing something they didn't expect, and they struggled to react. The audience, both in the studio and at home, could sense the sudden shift. There was no turning back now. Melania's voice remained steady, but her words carried a power that was hard to ignore. She was speaking not just as a former First Lady, but as a woman who had endured years of judgment and criticism. For the first time, she wasn't sitting in the background, supporting her husband from the sidelines. She was standing up for herself, speaking directly to the public and taking a stand on issues that had been weighing on her for years. The liberal host, who had come into the interview with a sense of confidence, was now on the back foot. They had thought they could control the conversation, but Melania had flipped the script. The host was stammering, trying to regain control, but it was too late. The damage had been done. Melania's words were powerful, and they echoed throughout the room. It was clear that this wasn't just another celebrity interview. This was a moment in which Melania Trump was revealing a side of herself that had been hidden for too long. Why did Melania decide to speak out so boldly at this particular moment? Was it because she had reached a breaking point after years of being unfairly portrayed by the media? Or was it simply because she had something important to say, something that needed to be heard? Whatever her reasoning, her words were not something that could easily be brushed aside. The host, who had built their career on asking tough questions and exposing the flaws of public figures, now found themselves on the receiving end of Melania's sharp remarks. The room was filled with a tense silence, and the audience, both in the studio and at home, was left on the edge of their seats, waiting to see how the host would respond. To truly understand the significance of what happened, we need to examine the context of this unexpected moment. Melania Trump had always been a figure of intrigue, but she had kept her distance from the often vicious political debates that dominated the news. Unlike many politicians, Melania was not one to engage in public feuds or sensationalist rhetoric. She preferred to focus on her initiatives and personal causes, rarely making waves in the political waters. When she first entered the public eye as the First Lady, many saw her as a quiet figure who preferred to stay out of the spotlight. She wasn't as outspoken as her husband, and that had led to speculation about her true feelings on various issues. Some saw her as an enigma, someone who stayed above the fray and let others do the talking. However, this interview would change that perception. The liberal talk show host who was interviewing Melania that day was known for their sharp critiques of conservative figures. They had built a career on challenging right-wing politicians, often asking tough questions and calling out hypocrisy when they saw it. Melania, as a member of the Trump family, was an obvious target for such interviews. The host was eager to ask her about her husband's presidency, about her role as First Lady, and about her views on the political landscape. What they didn't expect, however, was that Melania wasn't going to simply sit back and give the answers they were hoping for. She had her own opinions, her own views on the media and the political system, and she wasn't afraid to share them. The host began the interview with a few standard questions, asking Melania about her life in the White House, her experiences as First Lady, and her feelings about the Trump legacy. These were safe questions, ones that Melania had answered many times before. But as the conversation continued, the host's questions began to take on a more pointed tone. They started asking about her husband's policies, about the media's portrayal of her family, and about the challenges they had faced. Was this a setup for a confrontation? The host's questions became increasingly pointed, almost accusatory, as they tried to corner Melania into giving a controversial response. They were hoping for a slip-up, something they could use to fuel the next news cycle. But Melania wasn't falling into their trap. Instead of getting defensive or angry, she calmly addressed the issues raised by the host and began to speak about the hypocrisy she saw in the political world. As she spoke, it became clear that this was no ordinary interview. Melania wasn't simply there to answer questions. She was there to make a statement, to make her voice heard in a way that many people hadn't expected. As the interview progressed, the host's questions became more aggressive, more accusatory. They asked about her husband's controversial policies, about the media's portrayal of the Trump family, and about the challenges they had faced in the White House. Each question seemed designed to provoke Melania, to get a rise out of her. But Melania remained calm and composed, answering each question thoughtfully and with poise. But then, the host asked a question that changed everything. They asked Melania about her views on the current state of American politics, about the divide between liberals and conservatives, and about the role of the media in shaping public opinion. This was the moment that Melania had been waiting for. With a calm yet firm voice, she began to speak about the media's treatment of her family, the constant criticism they faced, and the double standards she saw in how conservative figures were treated. She spoke about the way the media often twisted facts and misrepresented her family, all for the sake of pushing a particular narrative. "I've seen how the media treats us," Melania said. "It's not about facts anymore, it's about creating a narrative that fits their agenda. And it's time we stop pretending that it's anything less than that." The host, who had been expecting a soft answer, was taken aback. They stammered for a moment, struggling to respond. Melania's words had completely thrown them off balance. What did Melania mean by creating a narrative? Her words hung in the air, and the host couldn't seem to find the right words to respond. For the first time, they seemed to be at a loss. Melania had exposed the very core of what many conservative figures had been saying for years, that the media often shaped the narrative, regardless of the truth. The audience in the studio was silent, waiting for the next move. The tension in the room was almost unbearable as everyone awaited the host's response. But instead of continuing the conversation, the host simply paused. They were unable to regain control of the interview. The defining moment came when Melania made a statement that would resonate long after the interview had ended. She didn't just answer the host's questions. She flipped the conversation on its head, calling out the hypocrisy she saw in the political world and the media. Her words were sharp, calculated, and they carried the weight of years of frustration. "I've seen how the media treats us," Melania said again, her tone steady but firm. "They're not interested in the truth. They're interested in the story that fits their narrative. And I won't sit here and pretend that they haven't misrepresented us for years." It was a statement that stunned everyone in the room. The host, who had been pushing Melania for a reaction, was now caught off guard. They had been expecting a typical response, a response that would allow them to continue their line of questioning. But Melania wasn't giving them that opportunity. The host attempted to interrupt, but Melania didn't back down. She continued, explaining how she had witnessed the media's bias firsthand and how they often distorted the truth to fit their agenda. After Melania's bold statement, the atmosphere in the room shifted entirely. The liberal host, once full of confident questions, now seemed unsure of how to proceed. They had expected Melania to be a passive participant in the interview, to give vague, diplomatic answers that would allow them to steer the conversation as they pleased. Instead, they were facing a woman who was asserting herself and speaking with a clarity and conviction that caught them off guard. The host, visibly rattled, stammered, trying to regain control of the conversation. They attempted to steer the topic back to their initial line of questioning, which had been about her time as First Lady. They asked, "But Melania, you must have felt pressure, not only from the media but also from your husband's political opponent. How did you deal with that?" This time, Melania didn't hesitate. "I didn't just deal with it. I watched it happen. I saw the way they twisted everything we said, everything we did. My husband, my family, we were under constant attack. And instead of running from that, I stood by him. I stood by what I believe in." The room was silent. It wasn't just the host who was struggling to respond. The entire studio seemed to feel the weight of her words. The audience, who had come to expect a confrontation, was now witnessing a moment of real substance. Melania's calm yet forceful approach left the host floundering for words. This wasn't a typical interview where the host asked a question and the guest answered in a way that was expected. Melania had turned the tables. The host could no longer guide the conversation in the direction they had planned. At this point, the host's response was more defensive than anything else. They tried to argue that the media had a job to do and that it was important to question those in power. But Melania was quick to counter, her voice unwavering. Yes, the media does have a job, she said. But there's a difference between asking questions and spreading lies. There's a difference between holding people accountable and tearing them down for your own gain. I've seen it. I've lived it. And it's time people wake up and realize what's really going on. The host's attempts to regain the upper hand were futile. The damage had already been done. Melania's words had hit home, and the host knew they couldn't easily recover from such a powerful response. The tension was palpable as the interview shifted gears. What was supposed to be an interview to challenge Melania's views had turned into a reflection on the double standards of the media and the way conservative figures were treated. The host, in their effort to confront her, had ended up on the back foot. As the interview continued, the host's tone became less accusatory and more conciliatory. They recognized that their usual approach to interviewing conservative figures wasn't going to work here. Melania wasn't reacting the way they expected. Instead of being rattled or defensive, she was speaking with confidence and self-assurance. The host, realizing the conversation was slipping from their control, decided to shift gears. They attempted to bring the focus back to Melania's personal experiences and her own thoughts, hoping to steer the discussion into safer territory. But Melania, the host said, their voice softer now, what about your own experiences as First Lady? You were at the center of it all. How did you manage to stay so composed amidst all the chaos? This was a delicate moment. The host was trying to give Melania an opportunity to speak on her terms, hoping to regain some semblance of control over the conversation. But Melania wasn't interested in playing the role of the passive interviewee anymore. Instead of giving a simple answer, she launched into a reflection on the role of the media in shaping the public's perception of her. She spoke about the constant barrage of headlines, the rumors, and the false narratives that were spread about her and her family. The media doesn't just report the news, she said. They create it. And they created a version of me that didn't exist. They made me out to be someone I'm not, and for what? To sell newspapers? To get ratings? Her words carried a sense of frustration, but also a sense of clarity. It was clear that Melania was speaking from the heart. She wasn't just recounting events she had lived through. She was calling out the media for its role in perpetuating the public's misconceptions about her. This wasn't just a defense of herself, it was a defense of anyone who had ever been misrepresented or misunderstood. She spoke about the pressures of being in the public eye, of being constantly judged, and of the toll it had taken on her personal life. I didn't just stand by my husband because it was my duty, she said. I stood by him because I knew the truth. And I stood by my family, because that's what you do when people are coming for you. You don't back down. Her words resonated deeply, not just with those who already supported her, but even with those who had been critical of her. She wasn't speaking in political terms. She was speaking about something much more personal: integrity, family, and standing up for what you believe in. It was a moment of vulnerability, a rare glimpse into Melania Trump's true feelings about her time in the White House. And it was this authenticity that made her stand out in the midst of all the political chaos. The interview ended with no grand conclusion, no final words of victory or defeat. Instead, it ended with an undeniable sense of tension, a feeling that lingered long after the cameras stopped rolling. The host, still visibly shaken by Melania's words, struggled to wrap up the interview with a polite sign-off, but it was clear that the encounter had left an impact on both of them. In the days following the interview, the media was abuzz with discussions of what had transpired. Headlines flooded social media, with many speculating about the true meaning behind Melania's comment. Was she finally breaking her silence on the Trump family's media treatment? Was this a sign that she was ready to step into the spotlight and speak out more forcefully on political matters? For many, the interview had been a turning point. It was the moment when Melania Trump, long regarded as a passive figure in the political arena, stepped forward and made her voice heard. She wasn't just the silent First Lady anymore, she was a woman with a clear stance on the issues that mattered to her, and she was ready to share that stance with the world. But for the liberal host, the aftermath was less clear-cut. They had entered the interview expecting to expose Melania, to get a reaction that would confirm their preconceptions about her. Instead, they had been faced with a woman who wasn't going to be easily dismissed or silenced. The host tried to backpedal in their post-interview analysis, attempting to salvage some semblance of control over the narrative. But the damage was done. The interview had shifted the public's perception of Melania Trump, showing her in a new light, one where she was not just the wife of a former president, but a woman who had been through the political fires and come out the other side with a clear voice and a determined message. As for Melania, it was unclear what the future held. Would she continue to speak out, or would this moment remain a rare instance of her stepping into the public debate? Only time would tell. But one thing was certain: she had left an indelible mark on the political discourse, silencing her critics and making her voice heard in a way that no one had expected. As the news of the interview spread across the media landscape, it sparked a wave of reactions. some in favor of Melania's bold stand, and others sharply critical. News outlets, pundits, and political analysts quickly began to dissect every word she had said, trying to extract some hidden meaning or agenda. The interview became a hot topic, with discussions running across social media platforms, television debates, and even talk shows. Liberal commentators, who had been critical of Melania for much of her time as First Lady, expressed mixed feelings. Some attempted to downplay her remarks, calling them politically motivated, while others admitted that her words had caught them off guard. The conservative media, on the other hand, lauded her for speaking her truth and standing up for her family and her belief. But the most interesting reaction came from the people who had watched the interview without any political bias. Many viewers, whether they agreed with her views or not, found themselves impressed by the way Melania handled the interview. They were surprised by how assertive and confident she was, considering the public image of her as a somewhat quiet and reserved figure. For many, this was the first time they had seen a side of Melania Trump that felt authentic. It wasn't about political rhetoric or carefully curated public appearances. It was about a woman sharing her personal experiences and expressing her frustration with how she had been treated by the media. The interview had humanized her in a way that many people didn't expect. It showed that Melania wasn't just a symbol of a political dynasty, but a person who had endured years of scrutiny, false narratives, and personal attack. For those who had previously written her off as a passive or overly sheltered figure, the interview was an eye-opener. Even people who disagreed with her politically couldn't deny the strength in her word. They recognized the pain and frustration that came with constantly being in the public eye and dealing with the media's portrayal of her. In many ways, Melania's message transcended politics. It became about the universal experience of being misjudged, misunderstood, and unfairly portrayed. Following the interview, public opinion on Melania Trump seemed to shift in subtle ways. While some remained firmly opposed to her and her husband's political legacy, others began to see her in a new light. For many, her blunt honesty and refusal to play the role of a passive political spouse was refreshing. As the conversation unfolded across social media, the hashtag #MelaniaSpeaks trended for days, with users sharing their own thoughts and opinions about the interview. Some praised her for standing up for her beliefs, while others criticized her for defending her husband's controversial political actions. But the one thing that everyone could agree on was that Melania had broken the mold of what people expected from her. In the aftermath of the interview, Melania gained a new level of respect from those who had been previously skeptical of her. The media's portrayal of her as a distant, silent figure had been shattered, and in its place was a woman who had her own thoughts, opinions, and experiences to share. The woman who had once been overshadowed by her husband's political persona had now become a voice in her own right. For the liberal critics, however, the interview was a moment of discomfort. They couldn't deny that Melania's words were powerful, and her calm, measured approach to speaking out was a stark contrast to the usual fiery rhetoric they had come to expect from public figures. Some even admitted that her response had made them reconsider their previous views about her. The shifting public opinion reflected a larger trend. People were tired of the endless media polarization. They were tired of seeing public figures reduced to stereotypes or caricatures. In Melania's case, her decision to step out of the shadows and speak candidly about her experiences resonated with a growing number of people who wanted to hear more than just the typical political soundbite. As the dust began to settle following the interview, the question on everyone's mind was, what's next for Melania Trump? Had she set the stage for a more prominent role in the political or public sphere, or was this a one-time moment of speaking out? For years, Melania had been content to remain in the background, allowing her husband to take the lead. But now, after making such a bold statement in a live interview, many began to wonder if she would continue to share her opinions more openly. Would she engage more with the media, or would she retreat back into the private life she had once preferred? Some analysts speculated that Melania's comments indicated a shift in her approach to public life. Perhaps she was no longer content with the role of silent supporter, perhaps she was ready to take center stage, speaking out on the issues that mattered most to her. After all, she had spent years as the First Lady, and now that her husband was no longer in office, the public spotlight had shifted away from him. For Melania, the choice was hers. She had proven that she was capable of holding her own in a high-pressure interview, and she had shown that her voice mattered. Whether she chose to remain a private figure or embrace a more active role in public discourse, it was clear that her words had already made an impact. Would she choose to speak out more in the future, or would this interview be a rare moment of public candor? Only time would tell. But one thing was certain. Melania Trump had just shown the world that she was more than just a figurehead. She was a woman with a story to tell, and the world was listening. The interview with Melania Trump sparked a broader conversation about media bias and the way political figures, particularly conservative ones, are treated by the press. As Melania had pointed out, the media didn't just report the news, they often shaped it. They took the facts and spun them in ways that fit their own narrative, sometimes to the detriment of those involved. The liberal host's inability to keep up with Melania during the interview was, for many, a reflection of the broader issue of media bias. It was clear that they were used to challenging conservative figures with hard-hitting questions, but Melania refused to fall into the trap. She wasn't there to defend her husband's political actions. She was there to speak her truth, and that was something the host hadn't prepared for. This moment highlighted a growing sense of frustration with the media's treatment of political figures. Many people, regardless of their political affiliations, had become disillusioned with how the media handled stories. They had grown tired of seeing news outlets pick sides, sensationalize stories, and engage in political point scoring. The interview became a moment of reflection not just for Melania but for the broader public. It was a reminder of the importance of fairness, accuracy, and integrity in journalism. Melania had exposed the ways in which the media could manipulate the truth, and in doing so, she had sparked a larger conversation about the role of the press in shaping public perception.